Imagine wiring $60 million into a business you have just bought. The contracts have been signed. The bank has written instructions saying that nobody can move the money without your approval. The lawyers are satisfied, the investors are celebrating, and you believe the hard part is over. Then, only days later, you check the account and discover that roughly $58 million has gone somewhere else. No armed robbery, no hacker, no hole drilled through a vault. The money simply moved because the people who controlled the business in everyday life understood something you did not. You may own most of a company on paper and still control almost nothing that matters. That moment is one of the shocks inside Mr. China, Tim Clissold's memoir of trying to invest hundreds of millions of American dollars in Chinese factories during the 1990s. But the missing money is not really the deepest subject of the book. The deeper story is about a group of clever, confident foreigners who arrive believing that capital, contracts, and modern management will let them master a vast new market. Instead, they meet local managers, workers, and officials who have survived political campaigns, economic shortages, and decades uncertainty, and who can see around corners that the foreigners do not even know are there. The outsiders think they are going to teach China how business works. China gives them the education. This is not a neat success story, and it is not simply a story about failure either. By the end, much of the investors' money has been lost, yet several factories have been repaired, thousands of jobs have survived, and Clissold's fascination with China has deepened rather than disappeared. The title itself becomes a warning. The person who dreams of becoming Mr. China imagines that, with enough language, contacts, and cleverness, an outsider can finally decode the whole country. Clissold comes to believe that this ambition is an illusion. He can learn more, listen better, and become less foolish. He cannot turn a civilization into a formula that fits inside one foreigner's head. Before we follow the money, one reality check matters. Mr. China is a memoir written from Clissold's point of view about a particularly turbulent group of joint ventures in a particular decade. It is not a court judgment, and it is not a scientific description of every Chinese company. Clissold says that the events happened, but that he changed the names of some people and businesses because he wanted to tell an adventure rather than publish an expose. Later reporting has connected the story to the investment group SMCO, but the book itself uses names such as Pat, Aegean, Old Shi, and Chen. So we should treat its accusations as the author's account and resist turning individual conflicts into lazy claims about an entire nation. The Western investors' haste and vanity are every bit as important to the disaster as the conduct they encounter. Clissold begins far from Wall Street. He studied physics and theoretical physics at Cambridge, then became an accountant with Arthur Andersen and worked in London, Australia, and Hong Kong. On his first journey to Hong Kong in the late 1980s, China caught hold of his imagination. It was not one clear idea that attracted him. It was the density of the streets, the written characters, the scale, the history, and the sense that an immense world existed just beyond what he could understand. He eventually stepped away from the safe professional path and spent 2 years in Beijing learning Mandarin. This was not the Beijing of polished shopping districts and smartphone payments. Daily routines could be slow, winters were punishing, and a foreign student could spend hours solving tasks that had once taken minutes. Yet that difficulty drew him further in. His timing was extraordinary. China had begun reforming its economy after the late 1970s, but the change did not happen like a switch from communism to capitalism. It came through experiments. Agriculture was reorganized. Private and collectively owned businesses were allowed more room. Special economic zones and selected coastal cities welcomed foreign manufacturers. Prices, ownership, and markets were gradually loosened, while the state and the Communist Party remained central. After the political shock of 1989, reform slowed. Then Deng Xiaoping's southern journey in early 1992 sent a powerful signal that opening and economic experimentation should continue. Capital rushed toward the opportunity. World Bank research records foreign investment actually used in China jumping from about $11 billion in 1990 to roughly $27.5 billion the next year. For foreign financiers, the numbers produced a kind of fever, more than 1 billion potential customers, low manufacturing costs, old factories waiting for new machinery, an economy growing at a speed that seemed to make almost any mistake forgivable. Investors repeated the same attractive sentence in different forms. If every Chinese consumer buys only one of our products, the market will be enormous. But a population is not a business model. 1 billion people do not automatically have the income, distribution networks, legal institutions, or desire needed to buy what you are selling. Mr. China is, among other things, the story of what happens when an impressive number is mistaken for a strategy. In April 1992, while Clissold was studying in Beijing, A friend sent him an advertisement from a London newspaper looking for a Mandarin speaker for a financial services company. It led him back to Arthur Andersen, this time to help investors find Chinese projects. Language made him useful, but the real value was that he could move between two different rooms. In one room were financiers asking about returns, ownership, and exit plans. In the other were factory directors and local officials talking about employment production, status, and government relationships. The same deal could sound perfectly sensible in each room, while meaning something entirely different to the people inside it. Then Clissold met the American he calls Pat. Pat had risen from a steelworking family to the top of Wall Street. He was forceful, ambitious, and almost physically incapable of thinking small. He wanted to build a machine that would carry American capital into Asian industry, and China was the great prize. He teamed up with Clissold and a Chinese colleague called Agen, whom the book describes as having lived through the Cultural Revolution and the Red Guard years. I brought a kind of knowledge no language course could provide, a feeling for political memory, local pride, indirect communication, and the limits of what people would say aloud. The three traveled. They crossed provinces, slept in indifferent hotels, sat through elaborate meetings, and visited factories hidden in valleys or attached to industrial cities. At each stop, they met officials eager to attract investment and managers eager to describe expansion. Hospitality was part of negotiation. Banquets lasted for hours, toasts arrived one after another, and a visitor's willingness to participate became a test of warmth and endurance. It is easy for a foreign memoir to turn these scenes into a joke about unusual food or incomprehensible customs, and some reviewers thought Clissold occasionally leaned too hard on that comedy. The fairer point is that the visitors were being assessed just as actively as they were assessing their hosts. They concentrated increasingly on vehicle components. China was motorizing, and the reasoning sounded solid. A car or truck requires thousands of parts. Existing factories had workers, land, and relationships with customers, but often lacked capital, quality systems, and modern equipment. The foreigners would buy stakes, supply money and management methods, improve productivity, and combine businesses into a national group. The Chinese partners would receive investment, technology, and access to larger markets. On a presentation slide, everybody won. They found support in places such as Changchun, a northeastern industrial center built around vehicle manufacturing, where younger, reform-minded officials wanted growth. Pat sold the dream on Wall Street with the same force he brought to everything else. The group eventually raised more than $400 million. Within about 2 years, it had acquired interests in around 20 Chinese businesses, employing roughly 25,000 people. They had gone from touring workshops to becoming one of the largest foreign financial investors in the country at the height of the boom. The speed looked like proof of brilliance. In retrospect, it was also the first warning. To understand why, you have to understand what a factory could mean in China at that moment. To the Wall Street investors, a factory was an asset. It had machines, inventory, employees, customers, revenue, and costs. If costs were too high, management should reduce them. If a director performed badly, the board should replace that person. To many workers, however, a state enterprise or former state enterprise was closer to a complete social world. It might provide housing, healthcare, pensions, schooling connections, family jobs, and a personal identity, not just a wage. There was no broad, dependable social safety net ready to catch thousands of people if a factory dismissed them. A foreign spreadsheet could label workers as excess capacity. A local official could see the same workers as families whose anger would arrive at the government gate. The factory director also occupied a different position from the manager imagined in a Western corporate chart. The director might have hired generations of the same families, secured loans from the local bank, negotiated taxes with officials, and controlled the relationships that kept supplies and sales moving. The foreign side could hold a majority of the shares and several board seats. The director could hold the loyalty of the workforce, the ear of the local party secretary, the company seals, the bank access, the vehicles, the records, and the keys. One side owned legal rights. The other side held practical power. Those company seals, usually called chops in English, become almost like characters in the memoir. A chop is a stamp used to authorize company documents and transactions. To a newcomer, it can look like office stationery. In practice, control of the right seal could determine who was able to sign, open accounts, move funds, or present themselves as the company. Clissold's team learned that protecting a clause in a contract was useless if an opponent could use the chop, empty the account, and make the clause somebody else's problem to enforce. Paper mattered, but custody mattered too. The investors also assumed that a contract ended negotiation. The local partners often treated the signed deal as the record of one moment in a continuing relationship. Circumstances changed, political support moved, markets shifted, and the arrangement would be argued again. That difference is sometimes presented as a simple East versus West rule, but we should be more careful. Western businesses renegotiate contracts too, and many Chinese companies honor strict agreements. In Clissold's cases, the important issue was the weakness and unevenness of enforcement during a fast institutional transition. A right that takes years to enforce in a court dependent on the same locality as your opponent may have little value during next Friday's payroll. The trouble appeared in dozens of forms. Financial statements did not always describe the business that existed. Assets promised to a joint venture were entangled with other entities. Managers used company resources to create competitors. Local partners agreed to changes at a board meeting, then delayed them until the decision died. Banks, bureaus, and courts could each have priorities that differed from the written law. Even straightforward due diligence, the process of checking a company before investing, struggled to answer the most important question: when a conflict begins, who will actually obey whom? Then came the kind of discovery that turns anxiety into panic. At the celebrated five-star brewery deal in Beijing, the group transferred more than $60 million into the venture. According to Clissold, around $58 million was moved out over just a few days, even though bank instructions were supposed to require approval from the foreign side. The protections had looked solid until they were tested. Now Pat and Clissold had to chase money through a network where the people explaining the transfer were often connected to the people who had authorized it. Five Star had seemed irresistible. It was a historic Beijing beer brand with an established name and multiple breweries, and the wider Chinese beer market was exploding. Global brewers were looking at the country's population and picturing an endless line of thirsty customers. Clissold's group defeated numerous rival bidders and invested not only in Five Star, but also in Three Ring, a nearby brewery licensed to use the Five Star name. They thought owning both would remove a competitive threat. Instead, they acquired a family argument. The businesses quarreled over who could use which labels and where each could sell, so the investors sometimes found one of their own factories competing with another. Inside Five Star, modern equipment and a famous brand existed beside basic failures of management. Bottles on the production line could be underfilled or poorly cleaned. Some finished containers reached the market with no usable beer inside. Branding multiplied into a confusing collection of labels rather than building one clear identity. Clissold could point to quality problems, but a diagnosis was not the same as a cure. Workers had grown used to weak supervision. Departments defended their own people. Extended family and friendship networks complicated promotion and discipline. Managers could agree with a reform in the meeting room and then let the old routine continue once the visitor left. It is tempting to hear this and conclude that the workers simply did not care. The book's fuller picture is more uncomfortable and more human. If pay barely changes with effort, if promotion follows connections, if poor performance has no consequence and excellent performance brings little reward, indifference can be perfectly rational. If 3 times as many people are assigned to a job as the work requires, boredom and internal politics fill the day. The failure was not written into anyone's nationality. It was produced by incentives, fear habit, and a system halfway between an old work unit and a competitive company. Reducing employment was politically and morally explosive. The Chinese partner feared unrest, while foreign directors saw labor costs destroying the business. Meanwhile, a strong local competitor, Yanjing, gained ground, and the entire beer industry suffered from overinvestment. Foreign brewers had poured huge sums into capacity because they all saw the same enormous market. Supply expanded faster than profitable demand. Price competition intensified. Weak local breweries received support to protect jobs, and the supposedly easy growth story became a crowded fight. Five Star was not sinking in isolation. It was caught between its internal paralysis and an industry that the investors themselves had helped overheat. Clissold's team tried one manager after another. Each new appointment appeared to be the person who could finally combine Chinese local knowledge with international discipline. One improved sales and morale for a time, but the recovery did not last. Another seemed ideally qualified and then became part of a fresh crisis. Clissold repeatedly discovers that finding an impressive person is not the same as building a system. If one manager must personally overcome every informal network, every political veto, every weak control, and every historical grievance, even the perfect candidate will eventually be consumed. The auto parts ventures produce their own battles. One of the most revealing centers on the factory director Clissold calls old Xi. Xi was not a cartoon villain. He was capable, theatrical, stubborn, and deeply rooted in a valley where his standing extended far beyond his job title. The foreigners came to believe that he was building a competing operation nearby, while the joint venture supplied resources people and opportunity. From their perspective, this was a direct theft of value. From Xi's position, the foreign capital was one more force entering a world he had built and expected to control. Neither side was going to yield politely. The contracts allowed the board to remove Xi, but only if they could get him into a valid board meeting. So, the team planned the takeover with the intensity of a military operation. They prepared different notices depending on whether he resigned or had to be dismissed. They arranged their own transport in case factory drivers refused to help. They selected a replacement team and tried to secure the accounts and reassure workers at the same time. This was no longer the elegant world of acquisition models. It was a contest over buildings, loyalty, information, and who could appear to be in command when the gates opened the next morning. She attended a meeting away from his home territory and after pressure signed his resignation. But while the foreign team traveled back toward the factory, she moved faster. By the time they arrived, much of the management structure had vanished, money had been transferred, and the plant was dark. People whom the investors believed worked for the company demonstrated that their loyalty belonged somewhere else. The board had won the resolution and lost the first hours after it. Again, formal authority arrived after practical power had already acted. The replacement manager, Chang, answered theater with theater. When most of the senior and middle management walked out together to join Xi, Chang insisted the business could survive. He tore down shabby gates and displayed plans for grander ones, a visible claim that the factory still had a future. Around the Lantern Festival, he organized an enormous fireworks display that drew people from across the valley. On a balance sheet, fireworks are an unnecessary cost. In a frightened community, they can be a signal the plant is not dead, the new management is not hiding, and wages may still exist tomorrow. Morale is an economic asset even when the accountants cannot find a line for it. The struggle was not clean. Tempers rose, employees were dismissed, local relationships hardened, and each side tried to isolate the other. Clissold sometimes admired the courage of his new managers while worrying that their aggression created new enemies. That contradiction matters. The foreigners had spent years demanding decisive Chinese leadership. When decisive local leaders appeared, they brought their own ambitions and methods. Empowerment did not mean creating obedient copies of Western executives. It meant trusting people who might challenge the foreign side too. In the end, the battle with Xi changes Clissold more than it validates him. Once the immediate struggle settles, he sees his opponent not as a symbol of everything wrong with China, but as a resourceful person fighting for his own future. Years later, Clissold returns to seek business with him again. That does not erase allegations of diverted business or damaged investments. It does show the memoir moving away from conquest. Conflict creates knowledge that the early banquets and presentations could not. Clissold no longer imagines that understanding a person means defeating them. Another crisis unfolds around Jingzhou, an old walled city in Hubei beside the waterways of the Yangtze region. In the book, the dispute involves a factory director called Chen and questions about assets, including land that the foreign side believed belonged inside the joint venture. The atmosphere is already tense, violence touches the story, and Chen is at one point shot in the leg by an unknown attacker. When the investors try to remove him and install their own controls, workers resist and the outsiders are forced away from the factory. A corporate disagreement has turned into a siege. Here the human stakes sit in plain view. At a government building, Clissold encounters workers from another collapsed state business pleading because they have lost the foundation of family life. For the local authorities, one failed factory can mean unpaid wages, protests, and hundreds of households with nowhere to turn. This does not excuse fraud or make contracts optional. It explains why an official who warmly welcomed foreign money might become evasive when foreign management threatens employment. The official is not judging only the company's return on capital. The official is managing social stability, political responsibility, and personal career risk. Locked outside the Jingzhou plant, Clissold's side keeps control of the company chops, preventing the opposing group from freely operating the accounts. Days stretch into weeks. Calls go unanswered. Local government promises process, but produces little visible action. Clissold walks around the city's walls, thinking through options while the business bleeds. The image is perfect for the book. The foreign majority shareholder is physically outside, circling an ancient wall, holding a legal symbol of power, and still unable to enter the place it supposedly controls. The breakthrough comes not from one decisive court ruling, but from pressure assembled through relationships, publicity, and patience. Journalists arrive, government attention sharpens, and the political cost of letting the dispute continue rises. Eventually the parties negotiate. The land returns to the venture, Chen gives up the management role, and tighter financial controls are installed. It is a qualified victory, reached through exactly the kind of indirect campaign the foreigners once dismissed as irrational. To make the formal agreement real, they first had to change the network of incentives around it. Elsewhere, a dispute over land leaves Clissold and colleagues barricaded by angry workers for about 9 hours. Other cases involve managers establishing rival businesses, funds traveling through unexplained channels, and investigators who are not the clean, automatic enforcement mechanism the investors expect. The details vary, but the pattern repeats. Each acquisition was priced as an individual company. Each crisis revealed an entire local system attached to it. The investors had bought shares in factories without understanding that they were also entering histories, political bargains, and communities. These pressures damaged Clissold physically. Still in his 30s, he suffers a heart attack. The memoir does not present this as a dramatic badge of entrepreneurial honor. It feels more like the body's final refusal to continue living at the speed of permanent emergency. There is always another flight, another vanished payment, another board fight, another factory director who has agreed and not agreed at the same time. The dream of becoming the indispensable old China hand has turned into a trap. If every conflict requires you personally, your expertise has not created control. It has created dependence. And yet, beneath the disasters, the company begins to improve. Over roughly 3 years, the group replaces 15 of the original 17 Chinese factory directors, sometimes replacing the replacement as well. In the worst period, the businesses report losses of around $40 million. A few years later, according to Clissold, the group is making close to 20 million and generating cash. New incentives help local managers connect their own success with the performance of the factories. Markets improve. Plants that seem doomed continue operating. Thousands of jobs are preserved. This is where the verdict becomes complicated. Operationally, the turnaround is real. Financially, the original investment is still a painful failure because the early hole is too deep. Improving annual profit cannot magically recover hundreds of millions spent badly, diverted, or trapped. Wall Street investors lose a great deal of money. Both statements can be true. The later managers create healthier businesses, and the fund fails to deliver the outcome its backers were promised. Business stories often choose one measurement to manufacture either a triumph or a disaster. Mr. China keeps both in view. Five Star reaches its own strange ending. The brewery becomes, by ordinary measures, desperately insolvent. Wages fall months behind. Banks want repayment. Court officials pursue accounts. Clissold tries to keep a small amount of cash moving so basic operations can continue while freezing orders follow from bank to bank. Then Tsingtao, a Chinese brewer with access to capital markets and a long-term consolidation strategy, agrees to pay more than $20 million for a stake. The foreign group retrieves something from the wreckage, but the larger irony is unmistakable. Pat had predicted that industries would consolidate. He was right about the direction and wrong about who would lead it. Across the economy, Chinese firms were learning faster than the foreign pioneers expected. Stock exchanges in Shanghai and Shenzhen gave domestic companies new sources of capital. Coastal manufacturing gathered momentum. Local entrepreneurs moved quickly, recruited talent, and bought competitors. Foreign investment brought money, equipment, access to markets, and pressure to improve. It helped light the fuse, but it did not own the explosion. The transformation was being driven increasingly by Chinese workers, managers, engineers, consumers, and investors themselves. Clissold eventually parts company with Pat. Their disagreement is not just personal. Pat remains attached to the original vision of building a foreign, controlled industrial group. Clissold sees value in resolving distressed situations, sometimes by connecting troubled foreign ventures with stronger Chinese buyers. One wants to prove the old strategy can still win. The other has learned that recovering something may require surrendering the original dream. Clissold later goes on to work in distressed asset recovery, including at major professional and financial firms, carrying forward the education these battles gave him. So what is the book actually teaching? The first lesson is that market size is not a plan. The sentence about selling one item to every person in China ignores price, geography, taste, competition, regulation, and distribution. A huge market can contain huge demand, but also huge distances and thousands of local markets. Excitement about scale encourages speed. Speed reduces the time spent asking whether the cash can be controlled, whether the customers are real, and whether the partner's goals match yours. The second lesson is that ownership and control are separate things. Shares tell you who should receive value. They do not tell you who can authorize tomorrow's payment, stop the delivery truck, call the mayor, persuade workers to walk out, or take the customer list to a new factory. Before investing, you need two maps. One is the legal map of contracts, boards, and equity. The other is the human map of loyalty, authority, dependence, and consequence. If the maps disagree, the human map usually moves first. The third lesson is about incentives. Many of the book's apparently mysterious behaviors become understandable once you ask what each person gains or fears losing. A factory director may lose status, income, and an entire local power base if reforms succeed. A worker may lose housing and family security if efficiency improves. A mayor may gain investment today and face protests tomorrow. A foreign executive may earn praise for completing deals, but leave the operational consequences to somebody else. Bad incentives can make sensible people produce absurd results together. The fourth is that due diligence must test reality, not merely collect documents. Who physically holds the seals? Can the bank independently confirm the signing rules? Does the factory own the land it claims to contribute? Are its sales to genuine customers who pay? Could the manager operate a rival through relatives or another local entity? What happens if the board dismisses the director? Who will the workers follow? A document room can answer what has been written. It cannot answer what people will do under pressure unless the investigator leaves the room. The fifth lesson is that local knowledge cannot be rented as decoration. Clissold spoke and read Mandarin, traveled widely and cared deeply about the country, yet he was still repeatedly surprised. Language opened doors. It did not remove his assumptions. Successful cross-border management required empowered local leaders, not just translators carrying orders from foreign bosses. Pat's own later account emphasized identifying, developing, and genuinely empowering mainland Chinese managers. That is one point on which the competing versions of the story come close together. But empowerment also requires controls. Trusting a local team does not mean abandoning audit, independent bank confirmation, clear authority, and aligned rewards. Tight controls without trust create paralysis. Trust without controls invites abuse. The real craft is building a system in which information can travel upward without punishment. Managers gain when the company gains, and no single person can quietly remove all the money or all the people before anyone else notices. The sixth lesson is humility about context. The factory directors in this memoir had lived through a history the foreign investors mostly knew as background reading. The Great Leap Forward, the Cultural Revolution, shortages, political reversals, and sudden changes in who was safe or powerful were not abstract chapters to them. Survival could reward flexibility, personal networks, and a reluctance to place complete faith in permanent rules. That history does not make dishonest conduct acceptable. It does make it comprehensible. Understanding is not surrender, it is the beginning of effective judgment. And the seventh lesson is not to freeze China in the 1990s. The legal system, corporate governance, banking, private enterprise, and professional management have changed enormously since the events of Mr. China, even though cross-border disputes and local protection have not vanished. The book remains valuable as a study of transition and overconfidence, not as a tourist's checklist of eternal national traits. Any reader who finishes saying, Chinese people cannot be trusted, has missed Clissold's conclusion almost completely. He ends by looking beyond the coastal boom to people whose lives are improving much more slowly. He remembers industrial valleys, farmers and miners doing dangerous work because few alternatives exist. The wealth visible in the new cities is real, but uneven. That perspective changes the emotional balance of the memoir. The Chinese characters cease to be obstacles in a foreign investment case and become people pushing for security and a better life. Some behave badly. Some act with startling courage. Most are mixtures, exactly like the outsiders judging them. That may be the most important reversal in the book. At the beginning, China is the object and the Westerners are the actors. China is a market to enter, a puzzle to solve, a sleeping giant waiting for capital. By the end, the country is full of actors with their own plans, and the foreigners are only one temporary force moving through the story. The investors did contribute money, technology, and pressure. They also misread, damaged, and learned. China did not wait to be modernized by them. It absorbed what was useful, resisted what was threatening, and continued changing on its own terms. Even the book's most dramatic image, all that money vanishing from the brewery account, looks different by the end. It was not magic and it was not proof of some unknowable national character. It was a control failure. The investors transferred a vast sum before they possessed reliable operational authority. They believed a bank instruction could substitute for tested relationships and independent verification. Other people understood the gap and acted through it. The disaster was exotic only until you described the incentives plainly. Mr. China therefore offers something better than a list of rules for doing business in China. It offers a method for entering any unfamiliar system. Begin by assuming that your model is incomplete. Find out what the institution does for people beyond its official purpose. Trace power as it is used, not only as it is written. Ask what each party fears. Build controls before sending the money. Give local people real authority and make that authority visible. Keep enough humility to revise the plan when reality refuses to behave like the presentation. And remember that every memoir has blind spots. We see Pat Agent, Shi Chen Chang, workers and officials through Clissold's narration. Other participants have told parts of the wider business story differently. A responsible reader does not need to decide that one side represents truth and the other represents deception. The useful question is what the collision reveals. Wall Street's models were powerful and incomplete. Local networks were adaptive and sometimes abusive. Reform created opportunity and insecurity at the same time. A profitable future could not be built by pretending any of those facts did not exist. If there is one sentence to carry away, it is this: capital gives you entry, but it does not give you understanding. $400 million could buy shares in 20 businesses. It could not instantly buy the trust of 25,000 workers, the cooperation of local officials, the loyalty of factory directors, or the practical knowledge required to hold a joint venture together. Those things had to be built slowly, and the investors discovered the cost of trying to purchase the result before doing the work. There is a wider lesson here for ordinary life too. We all enter systems we think we understand: a new workplace, a neighborhood, a community project, even a family. We look at the formal chart and assume it describes reality, but real life runs through relationships, memories, and quiet obligations that do not appear on the chart. That is part of the idea behind hyperlocal, helping the people in their own local world find one another and work together with more understanding. If you enjoy clear, detailed journeys through books and the hidden systems shaping everyday life, subscribe to the channel and take a look at hyperlocal, because the final irony is that Tim Clissold never becomes Mr. China, and that is what allows him finally to see China more clearly. The dream begins with conquest: master the language, master the contacts, master the market. The education ends with respect. The country is too large, too old, too alive, and too full of people pursuing their own futures to belong inside one man's theory. The money arrives with enormous confidence. Much of it disappears. The factories struggle, adapt, and survive. And the outsider who came to deliver the lesson goes home, understanding that he was the student all along.